Sorry for the late start. How are we going to get started? So I'm delighted today to introduce Karen Berntsen, professor in HCI and design, who's an award-winning designer that we were able to snag a couple years ago. From she's done work in the museum next door and lots of other interesting places, and now she's a full-time teacher in the HCI focusing on design. And she has a really interesting lecture that will talk about a lot of the different things you need to consider if you're trying to have a high-quality aesthetic design. And this will be useful for your homeworks, but also kind of in general. And there are lots of great resources. Thanks.
Thanks, Brent. How many of you have ever taken a course in design? One, okay, couple. All righty.
That's why you're here.
That's why I'm here, okay. I'm going to be talking about graphic and interaction design for user interfaces. And in the course of today's lecture, I am going to cover these topics: design thinking, the design process, the building blocks of design, and I've reduced the building blocks down to 3: typography, images, and visual organization. We're going to talk about designing for systems, and then we're going to dive into specifically designing for interactions. So this is obviously a very relevant topic. The September issue of the Harvard Business Review had this on its cover about the evolution of design thinking. And the editor-in-chief said that design leads to innovation, and innovation demands design. So anyone who's forward-thinking and looking at repairing existing systems or creating systems that are sustainable is immediately engaged in the process of design thinking. So let's just talk about the process a little bit. This is one of my favorite diagrams of the design process. This is called the lasso funnel. And in this, you see these 2 triangles that join at their widest points. Anyone who's a designer knows that when you're in the process of elaborating on an idea, you're continually expanding your appetite and dilating your brain and your imagination to create and explore more and more and more options. And then there's a point where you begin the refinement and you begin narrowing and refining and reducing your ideas down. And that basic rhythm of expansion and then a sort of contraction is the rhythm that is part of a designer's blood. It's part of what they do every day. And lots of companies have tried to diagram this. This is a very famous diagram called the double diamond, where the red dots, the first red dot is considered a trigger. And a trigger can be, through research, the discovery of either an opportunity or a problem. And we prefer to look at problems and opportunities without a strong boundary between those 2 things. Once you discover that, you begin to try to understand it, which usually leads to an investigation where you're expanding. Then you define the problem, you're contracting, you create a vision and a plan, and you begin exploring options for that plan, and then again the refinement. Again, an even more simplified version from Frog Design, where you first discover something, then you design it, and then you deliver it. And the delivery is where you do some of the user testing, which I think some of you are going to be doing with your prototype soon. So you get feedback, and then you make refinements. But again, it's always this rhythm and this sort of narrowing down. But it's contingent on being very expanded at the beginning and very open-minded. This diagram was by John Kolko, who is actually an alum of our program. And again, looking for opportunities, gathering insights. You know, one thing you discover a lot of things, but then how do you synthesize and pull together the insights from what you've discovered? Then you conceptualize, and then you come up with solutions. The Stanford D School is very big on empathy, empathizing with your stakeholders, empathizing with your users. And this is where interviews come in, the very first part of the D School process of design. Once you've really put yourself in the shoes of your users, you begin to define the world from their point of view. Then you ideate, meaning coming up with big ideas, then you prototype, and then you test. The Luma Institute, which teaches interaction design in these very, very intensive week-long seminars, they've reduced it to looking, understanding, and making. But again, you can see the kind of themes that grow throughout with design. So I just thought this broad swath of visualizations of ways that established companies have described the design process would be useful to you to really hammer it in what those processes are. So the building blocks of graphic design, like I said before, are typography, images, and visual organization. Today I'm going to show you some examples in visual organization of information architecture, mapping and diagramming, and some dashboard design. But before I go into this level of detail, there's a very broad concept that is going to permeate all of these topics, and really all the topics I'm going to talk about from this point forward. And that is the idea of form and content. When you're a designer, you're constantly having to look through the world through the lens of, am I looking at the form of something, what it looks like, or am I looking at the content, what it is? And those two things in all areas are always wrestling back and forth with each other. Here's an example. From a content perspective, you would not be wrong if you said that these are all the same content. Male torso from just below the nose to just above the knees. But obviously the form is very different for all three of them. So when you're a designer, for example, if I were to do an image search, and I'm searching for a male torso from just below the nose to just above the knees, let's just say, for example, that these three images came up. Then the decision is, how do I meet the needs of my audience? What is appropriate for my context? How is this going to be used, right? So this is just an example of form and content. Does anybody know what this is? I'd like everyone to look at the form of this. Just look at the form and the shape. And can anybody guess what this is? Yes?
Is that a tree burl?
A tree burl? Nope. Good guess. Yeah? A comb or a hairbrush? No. So we have this form in front of us, but we don't know what the content is, right? We don't. Anyone else want to venture a guess? It's something you. Oh, you hang things off of. Nope. Nope. It's an Eskimo coastal carving. It's a map of the coastline. Water repellent, fits in your pocket, floats if it falls out of the boat, and it's totally accurate. It's a map, right? So I think the delight of being able to see that relationship between form and content is always fresh if you're a designer. Always looking for that seamless integration between form and content. Design is not decoration. It gets a very bad rap for being something you stick on something else to decorate it. Anybody remember any of these? I mean, some of them still exist, right? Yeah. So in terms of form and content, I think it's fair to say that these are all the same content. Is that correct? And all of them make you crazy when you see them, right? Right. So an HCI designer, and I think Brad was part of this, came up with the progress bar, right? It doesn't make anything download any quicker. That's the beauty of it. But it helps the user feel like they know what's going on, they're being communicated to. And here's my last example of form and content. Does anyone know what this is? The Nest thermostat, right? So when you look at the complexity of all the content and all the sensors that are required to make this work properly, that's the content, but the form is really what the user sees, which is at the front, which is very simple. Again, that relationship between form and content. And we'll be going over that throughout all of the slides today. Alrighty, so let's talk about typography. When I taught in the School of Design, typography for design majors was a required course for 3 years. That's how significant typography was. It is the building block of all written communication. And I'm going to read something to you now. It's not terribly long, that you will see in a few slides down the road, but I wanted to read it to you first. It's by Robert Bringhurst. He was the poet laureate of Canada, and he wrote The Elements of Typographic Style, if any of you are familiar with that. He's talking about typography, and he says, typography in the Newtonian view is nothing very interesting or mysterious. It is simply mechanized writing. Now that the silicon chip has joined the wheel, the lever, and the inclined plane, typography is also computerized, digitized writing. More complex than it was, but no more profound, and perhaps increasingly subject to fashion. So he's really poo-pooing typography. But then he says, seen with fresher eyes or from a warier perspective, typography still evokes the wonder and fear with which it startled the medieval world. It is a black art that borders on artificial insemination, and it can pose equally difficult moral questions. Type is writing that is edited, shaped, doctored, and made to reproduce itself through artificial means. Confined within the schools, typography is a means of implanting the fruits of chosen minds with the minds and lives of others. Set loose in the world, it is an uncontrollable vector, like the malaria-bearing mosquito, able to spread ideas as indiscriminately as viruses or germs. The possibilities for its use and abuse are potent and legion. So when we moved into a civilization that had the written word, it really did have an incredible sense of making people immortal. This is why biblical texts were so profound. People's thoughts and ideas could literally outlive them. And this whole sense of the spiritual and immortality and universality was really heightened with the event of the written language. So it is the building block of all written communication. And another thing about typography is that it is at the same time visual and verbal. So it has a very schizophrenic identity. Catherine McCoy from the Cranbrook Institute made this wonderful diagram about the relationship between text and images. And she says that typically, we think about reading text. We think of it as a verbal, rational, linear, sequential process. We're reading text from beginning to end. And that we look at images, we see them. It's much more holistic, it's visual, it's intuitive, and it's simultaneous, right? You walk up to a painting by Matisse in the art museum and you take in the entire painting. But she questions this and says, really, we can do both. We can look at text And I'm going to show you some examples where designers have deliberately used text to be visual. And we can read images, and I'm going to show you examples of that. And most importantly, I want to show you the relationship between text and image and how it influences our very sense of reality. Okay, so when we talk about typography, most of you are familiar with the difference between serif typefaces and sans serif typefaces, right? Great. Serif typefaces are on the left. They have those little feet. Thank you so much. See the foot on the bottom of the capital R? Those are all the feet. Sans serif is completely clean, right? The little feet are called serifs. Yep. We're also used to looking at text in terms of individual letters, words, and then whole paragraphs of text. So there's that scalability issue with text. And you're all used to working with text from when you were in high school, where you dump stuff into Microsoft Word and just are victim to whatever Microsoft Word does to it. Okay. So from a typographic point of view, I'm going to take you through the building of a document and how the visual and the verbal come together to influence meaning and the meaning of the words of the document. Here's a slide to really point out the fact that you can look at text as purely visual. The letters are deliberately upside down, backwards, and it's just a visual mess of shapes with different proportions and dimensions. These are the exact letters that you saw in the previous slide, but obviously now they've been ordered and organized. Again, visual organization is a big tool for designers. Same exact raw data. This is the raw data, this is the raw data. You're already seeing how organization can influence meaning. So if letters are the individual molecules, or let's call these atoms, when you bring the letters together and make words, you have the next largest organism, right? So here are 3 words. Can anybody say anything about these 3 words in particular? Is there any particular way you would describe these 3 words? No?
Reverse order.
Pardon me?
They're in reverse order. So it's the brown dog jump.
Okay, that's where the sentence comes in. We've got a verb, we've got a noun, we've got an adjective, right? So once you start putting letters into words, then words have different characteristics. The next unit of measure, the next kind of organism we've got is the sentence. Easy enough. But once we can make sentences, we can start talking about things that are very high level, very abstract, and very sublime. This is T.S. Eliot, right? Words move, music moves only in time, but that which is only living can only die. Okay. So we've gone from letters to words to sentences, and finally to paragraphs. So this is, in fact, what happens when you dump text into Microsoft Word. You end up with half-inch margins, 8.5 by 11 half-inch margins, 12-point text on 14.4 leading. It's either Cambria or Times Roman, right? You've all been there. So this is the text that I just read out loud to you. So you've heard the content of what this text is, and this is what it looks like on the page. So for my students, the first thing I have them do is they can't change anything about the text except for the margins and the placement on the page. Can anybody tell me the difference between this and this? Yeah.
The negative space on the page is allocated differently.
Oh, absolutely. Yep. Yep. The white space is very different. Does this look better or worse than the first one?
Looks more artistic to me.
Looks more artistic. Okay. Yep.
Feels
either side, but not in any particular direction.
Okay, more playful, good. Yep.
It looks more traditional, such as the academic textbook.
Okay, more traditional, good. Yep.
It looks more complete. Like I feel like this page, it feels incomplete. I feel like there should be more coming, whereas the other one, this is exactly what I want to say. And it's done.
Beautiful, beautiful. We talk in design about having a point of entry, a single point of entry, whether you're designing a screen for an iPhone, a poster for a billboard, a magazine article. How do you enter the content? And I think that sharp corner in that sea of white space provides a very clear point of entry into this text, as opposed to this, where to me this looks like it might be left over from the page before. Like maybe I missed the whole first 17 pages of the article, right? Okay. So the next thing we play with is texture. The word text means cloth. And when the scribes were writing the biblical texts all their lives, did anyone read A Canticle for Leibowitz ever? No? It's about how it's actually true, the scribes in the book of Kells and the biblical scribes went crazy in their lifetimes because all they did all day was transcribe texts. But the word text means cloth. And that's because as they wrote the text, it had to have a texture that was as even as a piece of cloth. So we start playing here with texture, okay? So the next thing we do is we add a headline. And then you have a very clear front door, very clear point of entry. Typography by Robert Bringhurst. Beautiful, right? Is that a truthful title? Like if you saw this, would it be talking about typography? Yeah. Yeah. Is this a truthful title? I read this to you. Do you remember when I talked about the black art? So raise your hand if you saw this in a doctor's office. Would you be more inclined to read it with this title or this title? Raise your hand if you prefer this title. And raise your hand if you prefer this title. Interesting. Okay, there's a lot of people in this room that are more curious about the occult or more open-minded to ambiguity, right? Okay, so this is the role of ambiguity in design, right? It can kind of lure, it can cast a broader net, it can allow for interpretation. But again, getting into the role of the designer, this is not a design decision you want to make if you're designing a manual on how to use life-saving equipment in a children's hospital, right? Not so good there. So again, designers have the ability to make these decisions based on context. Okay, so let's stay with the black art. And now we have a black art. Actually, let me go back a slide. We've lured people in with a black art, but the first sentence says, typography in the Newtonian view is nothing very interesting or mysterious. That cognitive dissonance might disturb some people or feel like they've been wrongly seduced by the title, right? A way to buffer that is to add this call out. A black art, the next thing that people will look at most likely is this large text on the left. Seen with fresher eyes or from a warier perspective, typography still evokes the wonder and fear with which it startled the medieval world. And then you at least know it's about typography, right? This is called progressive disclosure. Progressive disclosure. And what that means is that you give people information in stages and in bites of information. Further, with progressive disclosure, I've gone through and separated the 3 paragraphs and included these very dark black run-in heads, an uncontrollable vector and continuously alive, right? This gives people the option to read the title, read the call out, and then make a decision about how much further they want to go. They're not committing to a whole sea of gray text and then getting in over their heads and going, ugh, I'm not even interested in this topic, right? You're giving them choices. It's effective here. Not effective if you're designing the layout of Moby Dick for a book, right? In that case, you want a sea of gray text, and the author has jurisdiction over chapters. So again, this is design in a nutshell. This is our raw material. That's what we started with. That's what we ended with. And it's the exact same raw material. That's what a designer does. Again, it's form and content. This is the content. This is the form. Okay. So I did want to give you a few examples of purely visual typography, just because they're so fun. The Futurists had a great time experimenting in 1916, 1920 with sound. And they were very interested in the relationship between the spoken word and the written word, and in visualizing sounds. This was the sound of a bomb dropping from World War I believe, where you can see the sounds and then they fade as they go down into the distance coming off the airplane, right? This poster by Paula Scher for a concert, Bring in the Noise, Bring in the Funk, where the break dancer is obviously elbowing the text itself, and it's a very, very dynamic relationship between text and image. Very intentional. Design is a signal of human intention. Does anyone know who designed this? No? Does anyone know Shepard Fairey? Shepard Fairey designed this. And it was directly ripped off from the Russian avant-garde, which I have a lot of respect for him for doing. He did the Obama campaign in 2008. Again, that relationship between text and image and the power. It's a lovely little poster from a series for Florent Restaurant. This was designed by Tibor Kalman, who was a pillar in the field of design. A lot of his work hangs in the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. He designed the big black umbrella with the wooden handle, and the inside of the umbrella is a blue sky with white puffy clouds. He's just a wonderful conceptual designer. But again, you can see the 2 friends sitting at the table at Florent Restaurant. There's a napkin on the floor. One is having a baguette, one is having grilled salmon, one is male, one is female. Just playing with typography. Toulouse-Lautrec poster. Beautiful use of the capital L and playing with the white spaces between all the letters to create, I said text means cloth. This almost feels like a flouncy dress. It's got a really beautiful texture in it. And certainly graffiti art is all about the visual, right? Alrighty, so let's talk a little bit about images. And again, images also have form and content. So let's talk content. What is this? Content, what is this? A green pepper, a bell pepper, right? What is this? It's also a bell pepper, right? Green pepper, green pepper. Very stark contrast between form and content. At a glance, and don't look too closely, at a glance, can anybody tell me what they think this is? Pardon me? This is fabric. It's brocade fabric from Russia, right? It's designed to look like the floral fabrics that were coming out of France. The form is very much in keeping with this style, which was also very popular at the time that the other came out, right? But if you look closely at the content, you can see on the left we have tanks, we have soldiers, we have missiles, all the parts of the military and the Industrial Revolution, all concealed in this innocent form to look like floral patterns. Right? Again, designers are always messing with form and content and that contrast. Alrighty, talking about images, we'll look at the power of text with images. Does this text make sense with this image? Yeah. So when you see that text with that image, is that still a green pepper that you would use for a ratatouille recipe in a cookbook? No. It's been really anthropomorphized, right? Okay, so that's one thing, and that's like, okay, all right, fine. Does this text make sense with this image? So how can it be that the two words that mean the opposite, strength and fear, both work with the same image, right? That's the power of using text and image, and that's the ambiguity where there's an opportunity for designers to really influence meaning. Are there any questions so far? No? Yeah.
So is this basically demonstrating that the way we perceive like certain images can be like changed basically by the way you present it? Just
Absolutely. Yep. The image itself has form and content. I mean, these words would not work at all if I used the green image of the green pepper. That would be crazy, right? It's really to point out, you know, how malleable we are in our perception when it comes to form and content. Yeah. All righty. So let's talk about visual organization, another one of the fundamental building blocks that designers use. So here are a bunch of burned matchsticks. Many people would consider this garbage. So the content is really pretty useless. And you push them around. If you're a designer, you're always visually looking at things. It's a very, visual, visceral experience. You push them around, you push them around, and you place them. And ultimately, you can place them even in this order, right? So the power of organization is very profound. Things can be, like think of the scrambled letters I showed you when we were talking about letters being visual. And then you laid them out capital and lowercase, all in alphabetical order. and then you organize them into words, and then you organize the words into sentences, and then you organize the sentences into paragraphs. That kind of building block of organization is something that designers constantly work on. So on the topic of organization, there is a term, information architecture. Has anyone here seen Richard Saul Wurman? Anyone know him? Okay, this is amazing to me. Richard Saul Wurman is a designer. He coined the phrase information architecture in the 1980s. He's the founder of the TED Talks. He's the founder of the TED Talks, and he's a graphic designer and an information designer. And he designed a series of books called the Access Guides to San Francisco, to New York, to London. They were travel books. And when he got his windfall from those books that he designed, he got a lot of money. He'd been broke all his life. And he made a decision, and he said, what I want to do more than anything is get X people together for 4 days and just talk to them about cool stuff. And that was essentially the birth of the TED Talks. And he did that. But in his book, Information Architecture, he talks about no matter how you organize information, it can be boiled down to 5 different ways: by location, alphabetically, by time, by category, or by hierarchy. These are his beliefs on how information can be organized. So I want to show you some outstanding examples from Edward Tufte's books on information design that takes advantage of these different ways of organizing information. The first is the life cycle of the Japanese beetle. Can anybody start naming some of those categories that you see here of organizing information? Time across the top, beautiful. What else? Location, right? Above the ground and below the ground. Right? Yep.
Hierarchy is like the progression.
Beautiful. The hierarchy is the progression, right? And you've got category, right? You've got the plant and the beetle, right? Really magnificent, and something that says so much in one graphic that you couldn't possibly describe as clearly in words. Has anyone seen this image before? A few of you. Good, good. So somebody tell me what this is an image of. Who's seen it before? Yeah. Perfect. It's the size of Napoleon's army leaving the Seine River on the left. The tan-colored army is the whole army on the way to Moscow. And you can see the reduction of troops. Those are casualties, right? How much smaller the army is when it gets to Moscow. The black line is the return. Yeah. Very profound, very amazing graphic. Again, combining many of these organizing principles that Richard Saul Wurman talks about with information architecture. Okay, so a different type of organizational principle has to do with mapping and diagramming. And mapping and diagramming is really about abstraction. It's about simplification and abstraction and making selective decisions about what's important. So I want to walk you through some maps that show you this process of abstraction over decades. This is a map of London. And you can see the river, if you look closely, going through. This was the very first map of the London Underground. And you can see the relationship between the more literal map and this map. And then finally, you have the current map of the London Underground. Right? Diagramming is a different kind of abstraction. And diagrams can be used either to inform or to instruct. This is an informational diagram showing the parts of the fish. It looks very simple, right? This is actually hanging in a museum in London. The reason it's hanging in a museum in London is because of the selection process of what was left in and what was left out, and how simple it looks and how easy it is to follow. It's very deceptive. This looks like it might appear in a children's book, and it could. But somebody had to go from actually examining the fish to making a drawing, to reducing the drawing to its diagrammatic essence, and then adding those labels so clearly, right? It's a question of what's important and what isn't. And here's an instructional diagram about how to raise the seat on a certain kind of bicycle. Looks fine, but really quite well done if you look at how to expand is on the top and how to collapse is on the bottom, right? A very beautiful, simple design. You just retrace your steps and go backwards. Sometimes diagrams are extremely abstract, as in this example of the land masses in Great Britain and the surrounding countries. The United Kingdom, the British Isles, the Republic of Ireland. You know, it's really, again, very crystal clear and deceptively simple. Deceptively simple. You know, so a designer is going to look at this and admire it rather than say, oh, that's so easy. Another category of organizational design or information design is dashboards, which are becoming more and more prevalent. Dashboards are usually single screens of information that changes in real time and gives a signal to the dashboard observer if something requires an action item. So this is a dashboard that has to do with a classroom and with how the students performed within a certain classroom. If you look in terms of visual hierarchy and progressive disclosure, what do you see first? What do you see next? What do you see next? Right? And that whole point of entry. Can we all agree that the upper left masses, those big blocks, are probably the first thing we look at, right? And those are the standardized test scores. So this particular designer had all this different data about this classroom, but through the design is attributing the meaning of this dashboard to be that it is primarily to look at standardized test scores. This is an alternative design for the exact same data. And this designer with this dark black going down the left shows an overview of all the different types of information. We've got who are below the goal of the grade, who are failing, who was absent yesterday, who was tardy, what are the standard assessment scores. So I think it's very important to look at two visualizations of the same data set and begin to appreciate how design can influence meaning. So it's a big responsibility. How are you guys doing? I feel like I'm giving you 4 years of design in 45 minutes, but. Okay, so again, we've talked about typography, we've talked about images, we've talked about organization, But what happens when you have to really go up to scale and design for entire systems? How does a designer do that? Basically through a grid system. A grid system is an underlying series of invisible lines that tell the designer where to line up the text and the images in a document. They allow the information to be codified, and they're based on columns and rows. So this is just a simple example. You can see the red lines are the underlying grid system, and the possibilities for laying the text out are laid over in the black. Now do keep in mind that the optimal number of words per line when you're reading paragraphs of text is 10 to 14 words per line. Okay, so that top category would be way too long of an individual line length. I'm sure you've all read cheap novels where you get to the end of a line, and when you go back to make the return, you either reread the same line or you skip a line. That's really bad design. You need 10 to 14 words per line and ample leading, ample space between lines, so that you can comfortably, without any cognitive load, go from one line to the next. Okay, so I'm going to just talk you guys through a report. This is a report that could end up being 100 pages based on this simple grid, and we're going to build the pages one by one. You start with a grid, and you can see that we've appropriated that the inner two columns, hugging that gutter, are where the main text goes, and the text spans two columns. We're going to have small postage stamp images at the top and a subhead under the heading. The subhead under the heading serves the same purpose as on the typography example I showed you. It allows people to ease into the fine print. People, especially today, are way too rushed, and they don't want to commit to have to read all the fine print. They want to ease in or pick and choose what they're going to read. Again, this is that whole idea of chopping it up into bite-sized chunks and captioning those photos. Captioning a photo always gives the photo credibility. A photo without a caption is just a decoration. A photo with a caption is information. It gives it credibility. Then we add a longer call out at the beginning. You might even call this seductive. You're trying to lure. You know, the goal is to get people to the destination, which is that fine print. You can put an outlined image, really activates the white space around this fellow, right? Instead of just the box and the square, all that white space is suddenly full of energy. And then finally, you can add some color. But that kind of building of the page now allows you, if your editor came to you and said, okay, here's a 300-page manuscript of text, and there's headlines in it, and here's a file of images, you could suddenly start producing a 300-page document fairly easily, right? You'd have to make little adjustments on every page, but now you're going up to scale. Alrighty, so a lot of that was about print design, and the lecture promised that we would talk about interaction design. So what exactly is interaction design? It was a term that was first used by Bill Moggridge and Bill Verplank in the mid-1980s, and they met while working at IDEO. Alan Cooper is one of the fathers of interaction design. He wrote The Inmates Are Running the Asylum, and he recognized very early on with computers that programmers were designing interfaces for the end users, and this was a big problem. Alan Cooper says, interaction design is the practice of designing interactive digital products, environments, systems, and services. An example that I like to tell my students about this idea of developers writing the language that the end user has to live with is on the very early PCs, there was a little light that was green if you were working on the computer. And if you stopped working on the computer, the light turned orange, and a little piece of text came up next to the light, and it said idle. Idle, right? So you could walk up to your machine, and it would just be orange, and it would say idle. And it was an interaction designer who went up and said, that should never be orange and never say idle. It should remain green, and when you stop working for a while, it should say ready. Right? I'm ready. You know, it's a different human experience. Ready rather than idle. There's a very decent website, usability.gov, that describes interaction design as focusing on creating engaging interfaces with well thought out behaviors. Don Norman says effective interfaces are visually apparent and forgiving, instilling in their users a sense of control. There's absolutely no question when you go to swipe what you need to do, right? And you've all had experiences when you click on something, it could either be a website or an app or something on your phone, and you get an unexpected response. And it's so aggravating, and you no longer trust what it is that you're interacting with. So there's a real human emotion of trust. If you get what you expect every click of the way, that again is that progressive disclosure. I love this quote. In some sense, a successful interaction design is invisible to the point that the user is almost unconscious of the experience until it is over. So there are two sides to interaction design. There's the human side, and there's the system side. And when I teach interaction design, the students keep a notebook for the whole semester. And one page in the notebook is, what do humans do well? And the other page on the notebook is, what do machines do well, right? Machines never get tired. They're very good at computational things. You know, certainly think about a video camera on a parking lot all night, a security camera. You know, that's a much better job for a video camera than for a human. It's never going to get tired, right? But it's also important to remember, what do humans do well and what do machines do well? So when you're designing for humans, you need to think about their intentions, their sensory perception, their cognition, their emotion, their behaviors. The list goes on and on. You can think about context. You can think about cultural context, sentimentality, nostalgia. There are a lot of drivers to the human side. When you think about the system side, you're thinking about sensors or feedback mechanisms, data computation, state changes, things like that. So again, you've got the human and the machine, and trying to bring them into some kind of luscious harmony where it's seamless. So in order to do that and to bring the two together, designers are largely concerned with two things in interaction design: the idea of feed forward and the idea of feedback. Does anyone know what feed forward is? Has anyone heard of that? No. Feed forward means designing something that invites the correct response from the user. So here are two examples. One is a physical object, a trash can, with very good feed forward in that the lever that you would step on to open this trash can is at the floor. It's been carved out just enough that you know you could put your foot there, right? It's a very simple design. And on the right, we have the arrow to start a video. Again, very clear. If I push this arrow, it's a forward moving arrow, something is going to move forward, something is going to happen. That's feed forward. A lot of you, I'm sure, have had situations where you've either been on a website or an app or on your phone, and you don't know what the action is, right? You don't know which to press, and you end up just pushing everywhere. What's going to be activated? That's bad feed forward. And of course, feedback is when the system responds when you have produced an action. You know, you push 2 and number 2 lights up. And that again is so important. I mean, if you think about monetary transactions on the web and how important it is, like when you click, you know, submit and you get, you know, an immediate response, you know, your money is going through right now. Please don't close this window. You know, anytime there's a significant state change, that's when you need significant feedback to your user. Anyone use Uber? I'm sure a lot of you do. What do you guys think of that interface? Yeah.
To choose a destination, but I tried like 3 times and I always had to fumble around before I figured out how to choose my destination.
Yep. Any other feedback on the Uber interface? Yeah.
The way once you get the confirmation, the car can be seen coming towards you. I think that's a great feedback mechanism because I know when it's going to reach and where it is.
Good, good. Were you going to add something?
Yeah, so in other cities, there's different versions of Uber. So there's like Uber Taxi, Uber Family. I think that the way that you slide to indicate which Uber you want is both very good and lets the user for feed forward, but I often find myself doing it by accident, and it won't tell me that I'm
okay.
Excel until a huge car comes to get me. So
Beautiful.
yeah.
It's a good, I don't know if you all heard, but when you push something by accident, that can be a big problem. Alrighty. Well, I'm just going to end with an example of a beautiful interface design by Maya Lin, who designed the Vietnam Memorial when she was a graduate student. She was your age, roughly. And this was part of a competition that was extended to Yale by the government, to actually a lot of architecture schools. She was an architect. And the requirements for the assignment said, design a memorial for the Vietnam War that is reflective and contemplative in nature, harmonizes with its surroundings. The third bullet just floors me. Contains the names of those who had died in the conflict or who were still missing. 60,640 names. This was a requirement of the assignment. And the fourth one is also very challenging, that makes no political statement about the war because of how controversial that war was. So here's Maya Lin. She loved rocks. She especially loved geodes, and she was in love with a particular geode that had been sliced and polished, and she loved that shiny surface of the stone. She shared it with her brother from the time they were 3 or 4 years old. So she went to the site, and she started looking at the place itself, and she started thinking about the requirements, and she ideated. She drew some sketches. Again, go back to the double diamond, right? And then she refined her sketches. And then, of course, I have a whole lecture just on Maya Lin, but I'm simplifying it here. And of course, in the end, her sketches became a reality. Now, something that's really important that you might not know about the Vietnam Memorial is that when she won the competition, she was shocked and ecstatic. She was, basically an unknown student. And the government said, it's beautiful, we love it. We're just going to make one change. And they told her that the names, as they appeared on the wall, had to be put in alphabetical order And she had them in chronological order based on when the soldier died. And she said, absolutely not. And they locked horns and got into a battle, right? So again, this is all coming full circle back to the power of typography. What she said is, this is not a phone book. The purpose of the memorial is not to have loved ones walk up and look through a phone book and find the last name and then the first name of their loved one who died. The purpose is to search, and in the searching, to recognize and run your finger by the names of all the people who died, and to see the kind of company you're in. So I thought that was a beautiful example of the power of typography and the power of organization. The difference this would have if the names were organized differently. Thank you. Any questions? I guess, do we have 10 minutes? Yeah. Any questions in Silicon Valley? I don't know. How many of you are business students? Quite a few, okay. Do you guys know the Roger Martin book, The Design of Business? It's a wonderful book. He is featured in the Harvard Business Review article on the evolution of design thinking, but he talks about the role of design thinking in general in business, how it promotes innovation and risk-taking, all of that. No questions? Yep.
I have two questions. I guess first one, why would the government care so much about alphabetical versus chronological names? Why would they that? And not just put it into order?
My guess is that they wanted people to be able to find their loved ones quickly. And they weren't really thinking about the emotional impact of not being able to do that. You know, listing them in alphabetical order also turns all those names into an inventory, right? Not like it's just you're doing inventory. But other than that, I can't really guess. I don't know. Yeah.
So you mentioned that she was an architect. What's sort of like the difference when you're thinking about like an architect, the way an architect thinks versus the way a designer thinks?
I think there's a lot of overlap. I mean, we talk about information architecture. Certainly, architects work with physical space, but they also design according to this idea of progressive disclosure. You know, when you walk into a home, you know, how do you know where the front door is? And then when you get in the front door, what do you see when you get in there? And then, you know, this idea of stepping people through an experience. I think there's a lot of similarities, though. It's very structured. It's very, it's very much about building something out of raw material where the organization itself is what bears meaning. So I think there's a lot of similarities. We actually have a lot of architecture students in our design classes. Yeah.
So first what you talked about was giving users choices and disclosing things to them progressively.
Yes.
I don't want to ask a super heavy question, but is it ever ethical to sort of subtly limit their choices so that they get their desired result?
I think it's, you're always limiting their choices, and I think to do that as mindfully as possible is the best way to be a designer. Another thing to think about when you're designing websites or user interfaces is the power of the search bar, right? I mean, it used to be that whatever the navigation was, that was how you got to something. That's not the case anymore. So if people really want to find something, they can usually find it through search. You know, there are a lot of best practices that are very particular to web design. One of them is, people go to websites usually to perform actions, and you want to label things according to corresponding actions that people will take. You also want to label things very specifically with nouns and verbs. If you have I remember I was helping the health center here on campus redesign their website when I was the principal information architect for the university. And they had their navigation on their homepage, and it said like hours of operation, which was fine. And then it had services offered, or no, programs offered. That was the name of the category. And when you opened that, you had to click it and open it. It had psychological services, sexual education, drug and alcohol abuse. The things that have like a very strong, it's called having a strong information scent. People don't read websites, they smell them, they sniff them. And the cognitive psychologists have done brain scans and noticed that the closest brain activity that connects to what people are doing when they scan a website is actually smelling. So you want to name things very specifically. So what we did in that case is we forklifted those strong information scent programs up to the highest level. Programs offered doesn't smell like anything. No one's going to be there in a crisis and click on programs offered. You want to see psychological services right up front. Yeah.
Regarding things like the point of entry, like what are the best practices and do they evolve over time? Like for instance, 30 years back,
Yeah.
would people have reacted the same way as people react now, and is it expected to change in the future?
For the point of entry?
Best practices.
Yeah, there are a lot of tools that we can use to have a very strong point of entry. For example, and I know you've used these before, if you make text big and bold, it will have a stronger visual hierarchy. If you isolate text with white space, it will have a stronger visual hierarchy. Which is something that I find very beautiful. You can have something very small and very quiet just sitting all by itself, and it will draw a lot of attention to itself, right? Color, structure. I think, remember when we moved that text down and I pointed out that sharp corner? That corner is a point of entry. I think as far as how styles have changed, definitely I have a whole library of books on typography and on book design, and they've definitely changed over the years. But there is always the importance of having a place to enter. You remember all the fairy tale books that you read when you were little that started with once upon a time, right? And the O is really big and has like curlicues. And then you end up with all capital letters for once upon a time, and then it goes into the finer regular upper and lowercase, right? That's exactly, it's to pull you into the fine print. So there's a long tradition of that. Yeah?
Just to add to how something looks and how you kind of perceive it in your head, I used to work with screenwriting.
Oh, okay, yeah.
The amount of white space on the page is very important, even if it has nothing to do with the context. So we would actually take scenes and put them at the front if they were more visually appealing, knowing that they would get rearranged later. So we knew someone of the course was going to read them, it would just look visually more appealing, and we knew that would put them in a good mood as they started to read it, and they would enjoy it. And then the second page just full of scene cuts and text all over the place. But at least they got past that first page and would usually continue on.
That's perfect. Yep. The point is to engage them, and ultimately for the form to engage them in the content, right? It's not form for the sake of eye candy or seduction. It's to pull them into the content. So. Yeah.
So now there's sort of this trend in user interfaces where everything's kind of flat.
Yep. Flat design,
and that's sort of just kind of developed over time. So I guess my question is, is that a result of people's preferences changing, or designers shaping people's preferences by what they decide is beautiful?
That's a fantastic question. I think it's more the latter. Did everyone hear the question? It has to do with flat design right now. Like, remember when it used to be that buttons really looked three-dimensional, and when you pressed them, they looked like they were going in, and then you would unpress, and they would change. And now everything has become very flat. In interaction design, there are languages, we call them design languages, that people just get used to and then they come to expect. And those languages are changing really, really rapidly right now. I think that at this point, the scales are starting to tip where flat design has become so widely adopted with the latest, or the iOS on the iPhone that adopted it whenever that was, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. I think at this point, people are just used to it, and that's what they come to expect. These huge kind of ground-shifting changes in design. But I don't know which came first. That's a tough question. Yeah.
Doesn't it kind of go in waves? Because I've thought about that a lot, actually, how when Apple came out with the iOS 7 design, I was like, this looks a lot like what websites did in the 90s, in the sense that all the links are blue basic text, and they've lost all this skeuomorphism. So, I don't know, it reminds me kind of like fashion, where things kind of
It's
become popular.
very much
It's just-
like
it's just
fashion
this
trends,
wave.
right? It's very much like fashion trends. Yeah, I mean, I think there's also a lot of accessibility issues that are coming into play. I mean, remember when links, you guys might be too young, were blue and underlined, right? I mean, that was great for accessibility reasons. And then when they stopped doing that, there was like an outcry that colorblind people, couldn't see without the underlines. So, yeah. Yeah.
Just that I was thinking that there's the aspect of like the early things will try to mimic something that already exists, so that people can make a
Yep.
connection to it. But now that we really know about it, you can move to a more abstract thing. Like if you think about the maps and how they change from being a literal drawing to
Yes,
this
yeah,
line.
we become more literate as a society, and we become more open-minded to abstraction. Exactly. I mean, I remember when Formica, that they make countertops out of, when Formica first came out, the people who made Formica only made it to look like wood. Rather than looking at it for its intrinsic properties. They imitated something. So I think when buttons were on screens, it was like, oh, we have to make this look like a real button. And then people get used to it and they can lighten up with it. All righty. Well, thank you guys. Thanks.